Karle, how long have you been attending our club? Do you remember your first dinner here?
Yes, and I remember the one at Fort Washington.
Okay, you want to get that microphone up? Oh, you just...
Yes. Oh, how? Hello.
Okay, we can hear you good. So you were at the early meetings there in court?
Yes, I was.
Okay, good. Well, you told me you often spend winters in Florida.
Yes.
And we had you on in the batter's box or in the bullpen for a long time. Now, it's a pleasure to have you here and take us back to now a long time ago, 1950s, and you've had some great experiences there for our country. So let's welcome Karle Naggs. Let's hear it from the man who was there.
Thank you, Ken. If you can't hear me, raise your hand or shout or yell or something like that. The slide we have there is of the squadron insignia of VQ1. Most of my active duty was in VQ1. Actually, 60 years ago, I spent 4 years on active duty. That was from August of 53 to August of 57. And I spent 25 months in the squadron called VQ1. VQ1 was flying top secret electronic surveillance flights, and now you know all about electronic surveillance. The first VQ1 operation started in 1951 when 4 P4Ms manned by volunteers started flying out of Sangley Point in the Philippines. One of the guests that didn't show up tonight because he was sick was Dwayne Hoffine, lives on Western Avenue. He was one of the first pilots that went to the Philippines. That was back in 1951. VQ1 crews in our squadron and personnel did not discuss flight operations or the P4M at any time, not even within their own squadron personnel. So, next slide, please. Okay, this is what I call the P4M Awesome Mercator. This airplane is actually the Dash 1 version. You'll get used to all this military jargon, I think. The Dash 1Q is the airplane that was outfitted for electronic surveillance. You can tell the 1Q from the Dash 1 is that it has a chin antenna, very distinctive for the 1Q. It was made by Martin Aircraft in Baltimore, Maryland. It was designed as a high-speed mine layer and had a top speed of 410 miles an hour. For your Air Force pilot reference, a P-51 had a top speed of 450. We loaded it up pretty much. I don't think we would ever see 410, but that's the way it was designed. It was painted dark navy blue, almost looked black, and with a single star on the tail and the wings. And it was very distinctive, and it had 3 turrets, 20 millimeter twin guns in the bow and the tail, and a 50 caliber deck turret. Only 19 airplanes were made by Martin Aircraft, and they all ended up in VQ squadrons. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a map of Southeast Asia, as everybody knows. This is the patrol area covered by VQ1. They were started flying out of Sangley Point in the Philippines. These covert flights covered Vietnam, China, Korea, and Russia. So you get an idea of where we were flying. We flew at night, dark of the moon, no lights, no electronic emissions, all the windows covered, And the only emissions coming out of our airplane were hourly position reports when we were on station, and one sweep of the radar every 15 minutes for radar navigation. Next slide, please. Well, how did I get in the special squadron? Any special training? Well, I'll try to go over a little bit of that. In May 1953, I was in my second year of college at Northern Illinois University when a friend and I signed up to take the qualifying tests from the Naval Cadet Program. The weekend, May 9th, they flew us to Glenview, and we took a day and a half of tests. And Sunday, just before we were going back, we were in the recruiting office. The lieutenant came in, and there were 16 of us. And he said, the following two individuals, please step forward, Al Surratt and Karle Naggs, and raise your right hand and repeat after me. As I was repeating this pledge, an oath, I said to myself, my mother isn't gonna like this. So the next weekend I went home to my home in Plano, Illinois, and my mother didn't like it. Not that I was going to be in the Navy, but she says, we wanted you to finish college. And I said, don't worry, Mother, like all good sons would say, I'll finish college. Next slide, please. Okay, on August 29th, 1953, I reported in NAS Pensacola to start a year and a half of flight training. Flight training at that time, probably still is divided into 4 months of pre-flight, 8 months of primary, and 5 months of advanced training. In pre-flight, which is at Pensacola, we morning classes, afternoon was swimming, then we had some PT, then we had some swimming, and then we had some military drill with the M1 rifle, and then we had some swimming. All naval pilots must swim, and there's many tests, but one of the tests is 1 mile with your clothes on. Next slide, please. January 1954, started flight training in the North American SNJ. Next slide, please. This is the same picture I think we have on the placemats. And I started this 8 months of primary flying. And I thought they trained us to do everything an airplane you could do. Except at the end of this program, there were 6 carrier landings that all naval aviators have to perform. And after that, I put in for multi-engine training. Next slide. This is a terrible slide of Air Station Hutchinson, Kansas, but the only one we could find. I reported there in September '54 for advanced flight training multi-engine. Ground school at Hutchinson was celestial navigation and long-range navigation. And for your information, all naval multi-engine pilots are qualified navigators. Next slide, please. Oh, we already got it. Okay, at Hutchinson, pilots transitioned to the red and white Twin Beach. Then we transitioned to the heavier P-2V, and that was the patrol airplane used in the fleet at that time. And the P-4Y2, I explained that to some table over here, was used for long-range navigation. Next slide, please. In January 1955, I got my wings and commission. And the Navy, like all services, allow you to fill out a card of your next preference duty station, right? And so just graduating from and getting my wings and commission, I selected San Diego, Jacksonville, Florida, probably Norfolk, Virginia. And the next day the assignments were coming out and everybody was jumping for joy of the assignments that they got, and I went down the list. Naggs, Karle F, VW3A, Guam. Guam, as you know, is a very small island. I wasn't too happy with that. But an hour later, a friend who was on the same orders, Gary Graw, came by and said, Karle, we're not going to Guam. We're going to the Philippines. And that's where Detachment A was. And this is one of the disguises that the Navy tried to put on the VQ-1 squadron. We were not attached at all to VW-3. The Detachment A was a separate unit, and that was really VQ-1. Next slide, please. Sangley Point. Reported to Sangley Point in April 1955 with a 5 weeks delay in San Diego to go to the Fleet Electronics Training Unit. Learn about radars and receivers and radar navigation. Sangley is in Manila Bay, 8 miles south. When I got there, I thought it was a World War II base. Most of the buildings were Quonset huts. But it had a 7,800-foot runway, and that was necessary for the P4M. I was the only bachelor in the squadron. At the time, there were 20 officers and 80 enlisted. And most people know Manila is at 15 degrees north latitude. It was hot. And the squadron was on tropical hours from 7 to noon. Okay, this picture of Lieutenant J.G. Flood and Lieutenant Commander Hutchison. And I found this slide and I wanted to kind of honor these two guys, which I'll get to later, and you'll know why. Behind is the BOQ. BOQ was mostly Quonset huts and a few passageways, like you see there. Bob Galloway, picture on your placemat, was my BOQ roommate. Bob was actually married, but his wife chose not to come over. So Bob was my mentor. He answered all the questions an ensign in the Navy needed to have answers for. And Bob took me on my first liberty to Manila, being 8 miles away. The easiest way to get to Manila from Sangley Point is by launch. You can drive around the bay, but it would take you an hour and a half. The launch was about 25 minutes. And so the first Friday afternoon that we had available, he took me to Manila. The port of Manila was run by the Army, and they had a happy hour on Friday nights from 5 to 6, free drinks for an hour. And so I was doing pretty good, and Bob came up to me at 5 minutes to 6, and he says, better get a drink. He says, when the bell rings, you're going to have to pay for these drinks. I said, oh, well, how much are they? And he said, 50 cents. The good old days, right? Next slide is the P4M Mercator. As I said, this was one of the few airplanes that could actually do the mission that we were doing. Okay, the wingspan on the P4M is 114 feet. It's 86 feet long and 30 feet high. It's bigger than the B-17, bigger than the B-24, and bigger than the P-4Y2, which, by the way, is a B-24 with 7 feet added to the fuselage and a single tail. The power plants, it looks like a 2-engine airplane, but don't be fooled. It has two 4360s. Now, 4360s built by Pratt Whitney means 4,360 cubic inches of displacement, 28 cylinders, 3,500 horsepower, and it was the larger reciprocating engine I think the military put on airplanes. Slung in the same nacelle with the 4360 was a J-33 jet with Allison J-33 with 4,600 pounds of thrust. If I'm not mistaken, J-33 was used in the F-80. Next slide, please. Another flight line. Okay, P4M carried a crew of 16, 4 officers and 12 enlisted. The officers were fairly standard: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and in the back end of the airplane was an officer that was in charge of all the electronic technicians monitoring all the signals that were in existence at the time. Fuel load on the P4M was 4,200 gallons of 130/145 fuel. That's a purple fuel. And the reason they use that, it burnt well in the recip and the J-33. The range was 2,500 miles, and the fuel load was 25,000 pounds, which was a little over a quarter of the weight of the airplane on takeoff. Next slide, please. Okay, there's Ensign Naggs. I was in the squadron, and I had 10 training flights for familiarity with the cockpit, and I thought I was ready to fly my first operational patrol. Again, this is Southeast Asia. Our flights were in international waters. Flight duration was 6 to 12 hours. And the other bases we used, besides Sangley Point, which is near Manila, we had Tainan Air Force Base on Taiwan. We went into Okinawa, this is Naha, Naval Air Facility at Naha. We used Iwakuni, Japan, which is right next to Hiroshima, and actually moved up there in October of '55. And we also flew out of Shitose Air Force Base, Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. Next slide, please. Okay, I thought I had enough training flights, and in May I was finally assigned to a crew. The pilot was Jim Dixon, and we were being briefed on May 16th around noon. We did it at noon because we are on tropical hours, and everybody had to go home and pack a bag because most of our flights were out, spent 2 or 3 days, and then come back in. Okay, my first briefing, I walk into the briefing room, and the first thing they do is hand me a .38 revolver and a shoulder holster. They also handed me a survival kit, and the kit had first aid components. It had the silk World War II maps of China. In addition, they gave us all 1 ounce of gold, which I had to sign for and turn in every time. So the information officer started briefing us, and we were going to go out on what I called a triple, and we were going to fly the 16th, we were going to fly the 18th, and we were going to fly the 20th. The flight, first flight was out of Sangley up to the coast of China, through the Formosa Straits, and then on into Naha, Okinawa. The flight was fairly normal from all respects, except we did have a visitor, an airborne radar, which stayed off to our wing for 15-20 minutes and finally flew away and disappeared. So the flight was into Naha. We didn't fly the next night. We flew the night after, and we flew another patrol out of Okinawa to the coast. And this flight, we also had an intruder. The evaluator in the rear of the airplane could monitor all known radars, and he knew when he had a airborne radar, and he told us that the airplane was sliding around to the rear of our airplane, which probably put us on alert. And actually, one of the turret operators said he saw a tracer, and that was enough for our pilots. We circled down to the deck, lit off the jets, and we got out of there. Anytime we had a problem like that, we left. Okay, we flew back into Okinawa, and then we didn't fly the next night, and then we flew the return trip home, which was back to the coast and through the Straits again and back into Sangley Point in the Philippines. we also had an intruder for 10-15 minutes on that flight. So I had a pretty good introduction, and I thought that was normal for our flights. That was my first, second, and third flights. On my 10th flight, I was flying with Lieutenant Dixon. Again, this was on July 27th, with Sangley to Okinawa. The flight was normal in all respects. By the way, the co-pilot normally relieves the navigator every 2 or 3 hours so that he gets some time in the cockpit and he doesn't get too bored. I was navigating on the way home. The flight was complete. Everything was normal. It was unconsequential. We were 100 miles out of Naha when we had 4 loud bangs. Bang, 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 bang. And the airplane started vibrating excessively. I do have instruments at the nav station. I have a compass, I have an altimeter, and I have an airspeed indicator. And I did watch the airspeed drop off, and we were losing altitude, and we were buffeting really bad. The pilots naturally thought this was an engine out. Needs to be feathered, the port engine, because we're in a left turn. Co-pilot got the jets going and sent out a mayday, and everybody was in their ditching station. Well, the starboard jet lit off fine. That meant we had a lot of power on the starboard side, nothing on the port. It was so dark. We flew at the dark of the night, and there's a heavy overcast that night, and it was pitch dark. And the pilot was still trying to feather the engine when all of a sudden one of the pilots decided to push the throttle full forward, which threw a lot of gas in that jet engine, and it ignited with a big bang, and the jet engine stayed on, and we ran it up to full power, and that was the only thing that allowed that airplane to keep flying. So when we started out at maybe 4,000, ended up at maybe 2,000 feet, and Naha tower was contacted, and we had a straight-in approach, which was real easy. And the pilot made a beautiful landing. We rolled to the end of the runway, turned off the taxiway, and he said, "Let's shut it down," and everybody got out. Now, the way to get in that airplane is through the nose wheel. And it's normally about a 2-foot step. And the pilot was getting out, and everybody in the rear went back. And because the center of gravity was all screwed up, it went back in the tail skid. And the pilot let go and fell to the ground and tried to cushion his fall with his left arm. And the only injuries we had in that flight was a broken wrist of the pilot. I think that's all I wanted to cover on that. Yes, I think it is. Next. Okay, this is a Douglas A3D. The squadron moved to Iwakuni, as I indicated, in October '55, and everything went smoothly for a year or so. And on August 1st, Gary Graw and I were assigned as co-pilot navigators on this new twin-engine jet, which the squadron was going to use for high-altitude electronic surveillance. The 4 pilots on that flight, since they all were in different P4M crews, got together and put us in one crew, and we flew a couple of flights in that. Okay, next slide, please. This is Karle by an A3D. We finally delivered the 2 jets. It was the first transpac of this particular airplane, and we delivered them in November 1955. That was about 3 months afterwards, but the next slide will tell you why we got delayed on delivering and picking up those jets. Okay, here's the sad part of my experience. August 22nd, 1956, Mel Hutchison, Frank Flood, James Dean, and Jim Ponsford. Jim Ponsford was in the rear of the airplane. James Dean was a new pilot in the squadron. He'd been in the squadron probably only a month or two. We were briefed on a flight from Iwakuni to probably Okinawa or Sangley Point. I'm not sure which one. At 11 p.m. on that night, our communication center got a message from the airplane being fired on by enemy aircraft. And that was the last message we heard from them. And as a matter of fact, they did shoot down one of our airplanes. Major search was made by the 7th Fleet for a couple of weeks to find survivors, but none were found. And the A3D crews were delayed because we actually accompanied the families and the wives back to the States. Next slide. This slide is 40 years out of chronological sequence, but I thought it would be best here. James Dean's wife, this was the co-pilot, just new in the squadron, wife just did not accept the fact that he was dead. She thought that somebody could have survived the crash. And so when she went back to the States, she remarried to a man by Schaefer, got an MD degree, but spent a lot of time talking to Naval Intelligence, the State Department, and anybody that would listen on any information. There was some classified information that a Japanese prisoner was released from China and he was in the next cell to an American. So I guess she might have had a little incentive there. But finally at the end, she asked a gentleman by the name of Don Rumsford, Secretary of Defense, if he would ask the Chinese on his next visit if there were any survivors, any prisoners being held in China. And obviously the answer from China was no, there were not, no thanks. Why did she ask Don Rumsford? James Dean and Don Rumsford went through flight training together, and the couples were best of friends. Okay, next slide. In April 1957, I left VQ1 for VU7, which is a utility squadron. And this airplane was the B-26. Navy called it a jig dog. J for utility, D for Douglas. Sometimes the nomenclature is confusing. Anyway, this was an airplane that towed targets for the ships at sea, air-to-air gunnery. And on one of my trips, I even towed a target for the Marines at 29 Ponds. I flew 50 flights and towing targets, and in August of '57 I was discharged from active duty. And I have one other slide that might put some things in perspective on the Cold War. This is an article in the U.S. News and World Report dated March 15, 1993, and it covered the spy war. And as you can see by some of the statistics, the shoot-downs covered Air Force and Navy in the Atlantic and the Pacific. But during the 50s alone, 17 airplanes were shot down and 125 airmen lost. One of those airplanes obviously was the P4M. And I'm not sure, well, at least I didn't understand how significant our spy war was. And that's all I had prepared for VQ1 and Mercator. I'm open for questions, I guess, if there are any.
While I locate some questions, I've got one. Did you ever find out what those 4 bangs were?
Yes. Oh, gosh, I missed the point. The engine fell off the airplane at the firewall. There was no engine out there whatsoever. I mean, this is more anticlimactic. When we finally got a torchlight out there was no engine. The four largest that held the P4M engine on the airframe, it was gone. Deep six. And the vibration was this firewall, which was 8 feet high and 4 feet wide, was exposed to the airstream. And as I said, if we didn't get the jet started, I don't think we would have made it back. And the pilots were fantastic in handling the crisis. Good question, sorry. What do you expect from an old man?
Sir, I have a question. When you flew those missions, was it the same grid all the time, or did you change the grid pattern, or what else?
Oh, there was more changes than you could shake a stick at. We went at it sideways, up and down, and everything. But the general idea was to fly off the coast and gather all the electronic information you could. A little thing that I forgot to tell you, since we were trying to be covert and we didn't want to be discovered, once every 15 minutes we got a radar fix. The navigation had to be really precise because all the work the guys were doing in the back, they needed the navigation to plot their signals, where they are and what's going on. And what we did was label all the islands and peninsula along our flight path with numbers, so that when I asked the radar, give me a fix on point number 29, he'd know exactly what it was. He'd put a cursor on it, and I'd tell him it said 320 degrees, 15 miles, and he'd put that in, and he'd make one pass with the radar, and he would come back, 14 miles. And navigation was really, really key.
Just curious, how much time and what did it take to go from one aircraft to another? As a pilot, did you have to get requalified every time?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, depends on the airplane. Some of them are a little simpler. I thought the Mercator was really complicated. I would say that a pilot, a senior pilot in the P4M was called a patrol plane commander. There was one pilot less than that. That was just a PP2P. You could fly, bounce, train guys, but if you didn't know the operational settings. So if you were a senior pilot, a couple thousand hours, you could probably land the plane after a couple landings. And I would say that you could probably check out in that in 5 or 6 flights, and as long as you study the handbook a lot.
Were you ever privy to the intelligence that you were gathering?
No. They didn't trust the pilots in front. No. We all had a general idea what was going on, but no. When they left the airplane with their officers and the 6 electronics guys, they had all their charts and notes and stuff, and I gave them my map, and that's it. As I said, we didn't even discuss between crews, where did you go last week? Never happened. Never happened.
You have out of the 6 crewmen, obviously a co-pilot and a pilot. What were the other jobs of the 4 other members of the crew?
Okay, let me go down this list here. We had pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and evaluator. And the evaluator was in charge of 6 technicians glued to their receivers. We had 3 turrets to man. We had a radar operator, and we had a radio operator. All our signals were not voice. It was on the key. On the key. And the plane captain that normally sat between the pilots. Now, how many sat? That's pretty close to 16. I didn't count them.
You said you had turrets. Are you talking about gun turrets?
Gun turrets. They had
So
to be manned during the flight.
So at what point would you have been authorized to fire on a?
If you see a tracer coming to you, open up.
Was the U-2 operating in your area? at
Yes.
the time?
Not at Iwakuni. The U-2 went in at Atsugi, Japan, which is up near Tokyo.
I had a question about the A3 Sky Warrior. I know they operated off of carriers.
Yes.
Did VQ-1 operate off carriers?
No.
VQ-2 did in the Med.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
They had a couple spectacular crashes.
Yes, they did. I think we had a tailhook, but none of them were carrier qualified, and we had bases to land at, and so we didn't operate it off of a carrier, not VQ1, but you're right, VQ2. I think there's a VQ5 out there, HVQ5, yeah.
I was in VQ-4 for a short time flying C-130s in a communications mission where they could talk to submarines.
Yes.
But on another note, in 1968, VQ-1 had a shoot down over the Sea of Japan and something like 23 men were killed.
Yeah, that was 59.
No, that was later. That was in the 60s.
Okay, there was a co-pilot on that one in the Sea of Japan in 59 from the Annapolis, and luckily he was a football player, a Husky, because they had some trouble with flight controls.
They had a Marine on board. I know when the one was shot down in '68, and a lot of the people on board were not aviation ratings; they were CTs, communication technicians,
exactly.
black shoes.
Yes.
And another thing, I was in Iwakuni in early 1966. And one of their planes, one of VQ-1's planes, had been damaged in a fire. They had set fire to the lower radome somehow. It was a C-121 Super Connie. So then later on, one of our C-121s in Vietnam was damaged. So they took the tail, half of the tail off of that Connie, shipped it down to Tan Son Nhut, and bolted it on our white airplane with a nice blue cheat stripe down the side. So we had part of a VQ-1 plane that we flew with for a while.
Okay, yeah, after the 50s, they changed airplanes. They were flying the A3D, the Contis, Super Contis, and then they went to the P3, EP3s in the 60s. Question?
When you were in the service, were you in 1960? When Gary Francis Powers was shot down in May?
Reserves. I got out of active duty in 57, August 57.
Hi. You mentioned that you weren't allowed to talk even with your peers. What did your folks think you were doing? And were you married at the time? And did you ever go back and finish college for your mom?
Let's see, last question I can answer, yes, I went back. I got an aeronautical engineering degree at Purdue. What was the other questions?
What did your family think you were doing?
They did not know. The wives of the pilots in the squadron did not know what their husbands were doing.
You were flying a blacked out airplane. Were your radar operators able to identify what was coming up and intercepting you, or?
We didn't use the radar. It was more or less a navigational. APS 33 is pretty much, but the guys in the back could listen to every known electronic signal out there. And they knew an airborne radar when they saw it. And they could tell, they had DFing equipment, and they could tell us that you have an unknown, unfriendly, off the starboard wing. He's at 3 o'clock. Oh, he's fallen back to 4 o'clock. Now he's coming to 5 o'clock. So the evaluator in the rear kept track of the airborne targets.
I just wondered how,
Why don't you stand? People,
Yes.
hey, listen, when you talk, stand up.
okay, so I was just thinking how often you could fly that the conditions were ideal in a month. you talked about, you know, celestial navigation. Were these new moon days?
We flew only at night, in the dark of the moon. We would not, if there was a full moon, we were gone. And there was no celestial navigation. Now, we had capability in the P4M to do that, but the navigation had to be so accurate that the radar navigation was adequate to get the points on the map. If I was doing that with celestial navigation, I'd be off by 25 miles. So the radar was required.
I forgot one thing. Storms, would that preclude your...
Oh, we love storms.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Radar?
Oh, yeah. Lightning, thunder, nobody's coming out there. The tactic we used to get away, if something didn't look right, was go fly down to the deck, light off the jets, and we had a radio altimeter is what they called it, and we would fly 100 feet off the water. None. Probably doing 300. I don't think there's too many prop jet interceptor pilots that didn't have good fire control. By the way, they didn't have fire control. They were being vectored, or they had a general search radar, no lock-on. If we got lock-on from shore occasionally, let's get out of here.
Stand up.
Karle, how many missions a typical week did you fly? How long was a typical mission, and how long did you have between missions?
Okay, I flew 82 combat flights in the P4M and the first 2 in the A3D. Our flights were normally 6 hours to 12. Dependent. Many of our trips were from Sangley Point up the coast to Iwakuni, Japan. That was 1,800 miles. So the flights were 6 to 12 hours. If we're flying out of Okinawa, you can hit the coast real easy, and the flights didn't have to be that long. Does that answer your question? Any other ones I missed?
Wait.
How many missions a typical week or a month did you fly? And
I think the most flights I got in a month was probably around 10 or 11. I had to go, I went back to pick up the P4M after I was only there a couple months, which takes, 3, 4, 5 weeks, and then I went back to pick up the A3Ds, and that took 2 months. So I wasn't really, so to speak, on the front lines all the time, but I ended up with 82 P4M combat flights and 2 in the A3D.
Why? Why were you flying these flights?
Okay, why did the United States need electronic information? I'm guessing, I don't write the rules, but it would be nice to know where every radar is on the coast of China, wouldn't it? And we went by every time and updated the data. The guys in the rear, the technicians, they would know the radar, whether it was made by Japanese, whether it was a Russian radar, whether it was a new Chinese radar. They could tell by the pulse repetition rates and the frequency. It would be just like there's their whatchamacallit radar. They were very keen at distinguishing what the radar was, its capability, where it was located. So they were sharp. Well, they didn't give us that information every day. They went back and did their thing.
You will get Karle over here, and then we'll get there.
Okay.
Hey, Karle, left here. China, North Korea, as part of Siberia and Russia and so forth.
Yes.
What percentage of the time did you fly over those individual areas?
I would say half of the flights were off of China.
Okay.
The other ones were spread. We only flew a couple flights off Vietnam at that time. See, I was there from April of 55 to April of 57. I think that was just the end of the French problem there, and we were just getting some basic information. The real thing was, what was China doing?
Okay, well, these countries obviously knew that you were flying here.
Oh, yes, they did. Oh,
Now,
yes.
how often were you tailed by Russian, Chinese, or North Korean?
We weren't, I would say I was only intercepted maybe 4 or 5 times and shut out once.
Because this is at night, you never saw them.
At night, no. As I said, dark of the moon, we were pretty hard to find unless they had good radar. We knew when we were being painted, and we were on alert.
Well, what kind of training did they give you if you were shot down? Did you have equipment to deploy?
Oh, I had those maps of China.
Okay. So let's say suddenly you're hit. What would you men do then when you're going down? What did you have to action did you take?
As I said, I really don't know, but every time we found out that there was an airborne and he was sliding around our 6 o'clock position, we would say, that's it, we're going. Now, if we were surprised and missed the information and the guy was vectored in on, like the airplane was shot down, by the way, I think it was shot down by a MiG-17.
How high altitude did you fly?
Our altitudes we were low. I'd say from 3,000 to 8,000,
Okay.
and we varied it depending on what information they thought they needed on a particular site.
And how close to the coastline would you?
International waters.
3 miles out, or?
They changed the international rules when we were flying, and I think it went to 12 in the mid-50s sometime. Somebody may know more than I did. But at that time, it's a 3-mile limit.
Okay. I've got more, but we have other hands over here. Stand up, please. You were here and over here.
Excuse me. When you decided to exit the scene because of an unfriendly visitor, how much faster could you go by kicking the jets in and knowing what you probable aircraft were by the radar signal hailing you? Did you know if you had enough speed to go faster?
Well, obviously the guys in the rear kept track, and the pilots, when they pulled the plug, they nosed over and made a spiral circle, and I had an altimeter, airspeed indicated, and I saw 375 in the dive. They go much faster down. But once the jets were on, I suppose we could almost do 3.25, something like that.
And did you have any idea what the speed was of capability of those that were coming on?
They got pretty good to tell us that it's probably a prop. It's probably a Lucian IL-28, which I think that was one of the first twin-engine airplanes that night fighters they might have sent out. They knew, as I said, they could tell the radar by what airplane and what service had them. Yeah.
Take that microphone to Peter Gilbert, will you?
Were the Russians or the Chinese, or for that matter the North Koreans, were they doing the same to the United States or our allies? Were they doing similar missions in reverse?
I don't think as much. I really can't answer that question. Whether they had surveillance flights, I would say generally not, or if they did, it was very minimal. Very minimal. Of course, you realize the Russian four-engine turboproper is a 6-engine, flies off the coast of the United States right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Might be a dumb question. You said you were issued 1 ounce of gold?
Yes.
Why?
I'm guessing that they thought we could buy our way out of China. And finally, after a few months, they stopped doing that. Somebody said, "Won't they kill us for the gold?"
Karle, what training did you give for evasion and escape? Did you have any kind of survival training when if you were?
We didn't have the elaborate training in escape and evasion. The only thing we had was an officer with a designation, and he tried to give us updates on what's going on the coast. But we didn't go camp out for 3 weeks and eat worms or anything like that.
Your pilot training, what was the most difficult part looking back? Just learning to fly those kind of planes. What was
the P4M?
What was any of them? What was the most challenging?
I had trouble flying the SNJ. I was telling my friend Sandy that it was made for a 6'4" individual, and I would adjust the rudders as far back as I could, and I still couldn't get full throw on the rudders. So their Navy has a neat system, a little backpack about this big, and I had 3 of them behind me, and I sat almost on the front seat because I kept scooping out of a slow roll because I didn't have enough top rudder in. So that was tough.
Did you keep in touch with any of your compatriots over the years?
Absolutely. Bob Galloway, whose picture's on that, I talk to him almost monthly, Christmas cards, and yes, and look, there's a Lieutenant Dixon, the guy that I had most of my patrols with, and the guy that saved our bacon when we lost the engine, fell off the airplane. Got to tell you. I get Christmas cards from him, and I keep saying, "Jim, when are you going to write the story up? Because you were in the left seat. I was just watching the gauges."
What did you do after the service, and how did you wind up here in Ozaukee County?
Oh, after the service, well, I went to school at Purdue. Worked for 2 or 3 years as a salesman in the aerospace business, aeronautical engineer. I was a terrible salesman. Then I went and worked for the train company in La Crosse, Wisconsin for 8 years. And then we went and I worked for 22 years with the Wisconsin Electric Power Company.
Did you get a civilian pilot's license afterwards? And
Yes, I have a commercial pilot's license with an instrument card for a single and multi-engine. But I haven't flown for 30 years.
Anybody from the family want to take the mic? Questions, comments? Anybody here? Any other hands out here? Any other questions? Well, Karle, it's with the passage of time marches on. Give us your closing thoughts here to this group about your service or about the military or anything you'd like to share here now in closing.
I don't really have any closing remarks except that it was a privilege for me to be part of the Navy, and especially the VQ-1. And I found all our services are well trained and dedicated, and I'm sure they can do any job that our politicians want them to do with ease. And it's a great service, yeah. Best in the world.
Okay, well, Merry Christmas, everybody. Karle, thank you. And come back in January.